Dear friends, welcome to today's live Apieva podcast on the topic of epigenetics in context, where my colleague and I will explain how the principles of epigenetics work and how epigenetic factors can help improve your health and boost athletic performance. And live a long, healthy life. Blanka is a lady who graduated from the Faculty of Physical Education and Sport. She has been involved in epigenetics for many years and has published a book on epigenetics in Czech. And the second one will be hitting the market soon. She runs an epigenetics counseling practice, is the editor-in-chief of RAN magazine, and among other things is a mother of 3, a wife, and an active athlete. My name is Petra Ilyashova. I graduated from the Agricultural University EFI, and genetics is my hobby. I love talking into a microphone. Blaney, hi. Hi, I've said it all.
Pretty much, yeah.
We've got a lot to talk about today, so let's start with a little icebreaker that ties into today's topic. Epigenetics sounds very scientific and complicated, but it does have some crossover into the world of alternative medicine. And spiritual growth.
Yes, it has a broad scope. So I'm going to stand up for this because if there's one thing that bothers me about podcasts, it's having to sit there behind the mic and move my head as little as possible so I don't drift away from the mic. Epigenetics has a big overlap with alternative medicine. It hasn't been fully researched yet, but basically, epigenetics is the link between what we do, how we live, what we think, what we feel, and the effects of all that. How our genes affect our bodies and epigenetics, from this perspective, explains a lot. Basically, all herbs, for example, work on an epigenetic principle. This has been proven, for example, with acupuncture. Meditation has strong epigenetic effects. Many of these practices that in some way touch on the spiritual side of alternative medicine have already been shown to be able to influence the activity of our genes.
Blaney, thank you. Let's dive into the principles of epigenetics, though some of our listeners may still not be quite sure what to picture when they hear the word epigenetics. So, what's the difference between genetics and epigenetics? The genetics we learned back in school?
Well, epigenetics basically studies the influences that affect our genetics, you could say. Most of us remember from school that inside our cells we have DNA, some genes, and those genes somehow control us. But does anyone here have any idea how our genes actually control us? The thing is, our genes don't actually control us. Our genes are just certain molds that serve as templates for making proteins. Each gene is like a little mold for one protein. And because proteins in our body not only have a structural role, but also an important regulatory role, since proteins are the basis of all enzymes. Some of them are even hormones, so proteins have that role too. They play an important regulatory role in our body, and it's through those proteins that our genes sort of control things. I sometimes compare it to baking Christmas cookies. Everyone can picture how you bake Linzer cookies. You need dough for that, and you need a working oven. And then you've got those cookie cutters in the box. And those cookie cutters are kind of like your genes. And those little Linzer cookies we're going to bake, those are exactly the proteins. And now I take the cookie cutter and decide what to make. Right now I'd like to bake some little hearts here. So I take that cookie cutter, which is the gene, cut out a heart with it, and put it in the oven. And then I'm like, oh darn, I've already got way too many hearts. I could really use a star too. So I grab a star-shaped cutter and start cutting. So basically, genes are the cookie cutters. Proteins are the little cookies in different shapes, and I'm the outside circumstances that decide whether a gene gets switched on or off, whether we'll be making those little hearts or not. So epigenetics is basically the science that studies external influences that affect the activity of our genes. Just like I needed to pick up that cookie cutter and make a heart or a star, not all genes are what we'd call switched on. A gene is functional and produces proteins only when it's switched on. If it's switched off, it's basically as if it weren't even in the DNA at that moment, because no proteins can be made from it. And what's the main message? Why is it important to talk about epigenetics? It's that turning genes on and off doesn't just happen by chance. We can actually influence the switching on and off of our own genes to a great extent through our lifestyle, as well as our thinking, emotions, stress, and many other factors that affect our lives. So that's the main message why we want to talk about epigenetics, because we have our genes in our own hands. Those genes are there, we inherited them, and we can't change that. But we can influence how much our genes get switched on or off. And because of that, our body either works the way it should or it doesn't.
Thanks, Blanny. I heard that somewhere, I'm not sure where, but it's not a conspiracy, right? We can influence 97% of our genes, and only 3% we can't. Those would be genes like eye color and so on. Is that true?
Hard to say. I'm not really familiar with that particular research, but roughly, if I had to put it into numbers with an example, say in the case of cancer, roughly 80% of cancer cases depend directly on our lifestyle and similar factors. 20% is due to genetics, although that's also up for debate. But we can clearly influence about 80% of cancer cases ourselves, whether we get it or not. And this happens specifically through influences that affect the activity of the genes in our DNA, because our bodies contain a number of so-called tumor suppressor genes that block cancer-forming processes, and we need those to be as active as possible. But at the same time, our bodies also contain so-called proto-oncogenes, which increase the likelihood of tumor growth, and we need to keep those switched off. Through our lifestyle, as well as our thoughts and feelings, we can influence the activity of the genes responsible for whether a tumor develops in our body or whether our body can fight it.
Yes, that's true. And last year, could you explain to our listeners how we can switch those genes on and off?
I'd like to start with an example so you can picture just how much gene activity in our bodies can influence. We all know bees. We know that in a beehive, there are queens and workers, and between these two kinds of bees, there are big differences between these types of bees. The queen is about this big. She lays around 1,000 eggs every day, while a worker bee is only about half as long. It lives just a few weeks. The queen lives for several years, and the worker is infertile. At first glance, they look like two completely different organisms, but they're not, because all the bees in one hive have the same DNA, just like the cells in our own bodies. So, what exactly makes the difference between a queen bee and a worker bee? The difference is purely in epigenetics. The queen, unlike the worker, has 500 genes that are active in a different way. So how does it happen that from the exact same egg you can get either a queen or a worker bee? In this case, the difference comes down solely to nutrition. While worker bee larvae get royal jelly for the first 1 to 3 days of their life, which is an incredible superfood, it's packed with nutrients that have epigenetic effects. And then after those first 1 to 3 days, they switch over to regular honey. The queen literally eats royal jelly her whole life. All her life, she's surrounded by worker bees who keep feeding her royal jelly. And that's exactly where the difference lies in the diet. This causes those 500 genes to switch on differently, creating the fertile, long-lived queen. It's purely nutrition that makes the difference. So to answer your question, the number one and most important, well, I wouldn't say the most important, but a very important factor, a so-called epigenetic factor that influences the activity of our genes, is nutrition. Basically, how does it work? It works like this. What we generally consider a healthy diet has positive epigenetic effects, and the things we know are unhealthy usually have negative epigenetic effects. Typically, when I say a diet high in carbohydrates with a high glycemic index, those are the so-called fast sugars, like sweets. That's an epigenetic factor that switches on what's called pro-inflammatory genes, the genes that control inflammatory processes in the body. So if we eat a lot of these fast sugars, we're switching on the genes that end up causing inflammation. And inflammation is one of the root causes of practically all lifestyle diseases, whether heart and vascular diseases, cancer, not all types, but some, diabetes, or osteoarthritis. Inflammation always plays a big role there. So even something as simple as sugar in our diet can, through inflammation and gene activation, negatively affect a whole range of processes in the body.
Thanks, Blaney, but still, how do I actually turn that gene on and off? Something simpler?
Well, you can't really do it that simply because genes are part of an incredibly complex process and very few things affect them in a one-off way. That means if I have just one cupcake, it won't really change my genes. But if I eat that cupcake every day, it will start to have an effect.
Thanks. And could you explain to our listeners some of the basic principles of epigenetics? Like, for example, gene methylation.
Gene methylation. I don't think we'll go into that in depth because here we basically don't need to know those reactions. There are a few basic types of biochemical reactions that switch certain genes in our body on, but one of them is gene methylation. It's the toughest epigenetic reaction, hard to create and hard to remove. By the way, methylation is what determines how cells behave during fetal development. Just like bees have the same DNA but differ, well, not every single one, but some types are fundamentally different. In the same way, the cells in our body all have the same DNA, but a skin cell isn't the same as a heart muscle cell, and that's completely different again from a brain cell. The reason those cells are different is because of what's called gene methylation. It's a reaction that permanently switches off certain genes. For example, in skin, the progranulin gene will be switched on because skin cells need that protein. But in skeletal muscle, this gene will be switched off because there it would be harmful if the cell produced it. So during fetal development, some genes are permanently switched on and others permanently switched off through methylation. But many of the methylation changes that occur during fetal development can be removed later in life. And that's an important point to make here. What we inherited from our parents, the makeup of our DNA, the sequence of nucleotides, which is the essence of genetic information, we can't change, but we can influence whether those genes are switched on or off. So even if during fetal development, our mother's poor nutrition, smoking, or high stress cause something harmful in our DNA, we can remove it later in life. Methylation is the toughest reaction. It takes a long time to form and is hard to reverse, but it's not impossible to reverse it. Some methylation changes can be removed, and there are other epigenetic reactions that are faster and respond quickly to changes we make in our lives. For example, many herbs work through what's called histone acetylation or histone modification, which is a less permanent and more easily influenced epigenetic reaction in the body.
Thanks. I just wanted to make sure our listeners know how passionate you are about this research. I'll stand up so we're on the same level. So, Lenny, let's talk about some of the strongest epigenetic factors. As an athlete, where do we start?
Well, since we've already covered nutrition, we can move on to physical activity. We all know why, right? We know exercise is healthy, but we don't really know why. The principle behind any sports training is that certain genes in our DNA get switched on. If someone spends their life on the couch, it doesn't matter if they have athletic genes from their parents that could predispose them to great performance. Our bodies naturally conserve energy. So if I'm just sitting on the couch and only get up to go to the fridge or the bathroom, why would my body build muscle mass it doesn't need? It'll only maintain the muscles I need for that walk to the fridge, but that changes the moment I start moving. I might start some kind of sports training. Anyone who's never run before and goes for their first run knows it's a terrible experience. The body just fights back with all the means it has to keep us moving like that. We're gasping for breath. Our legs hurt. Our heart feels like it's about to jump out of our chest. Just awful. And this kind of movement, if we repeat it often without the body being prepared, it could actually damage the body. It's a huge stress. So what does the body do? The body adapts to that load. If we start moving sensibly, we'll gradually increase the load. The body makes changes within itself that are basically meant to protect it from that dreaded physical strain. And how does it do that? Well, by switching on certain genes. For example, the genes for building muscle mass that had been dormant until now, then suddenly they get to work, switch on, and start producing those muscle proteins. Similarly, genes switch on that reshape our heart and respiratory systems, so our body can pump blood more effectively, delivering oxygen and nutrients to the working muscles. There are plenty of changes happening like this, and their main job is to protect our body from being destroyed by physical strain. But as a sort of side effect, our athletic performance starts to improve. So the growth in athletic performance in response to training is a result of the body switching on certain genes to protect itself, but it's all connected. Just to stay on the topic of movement, for example, our bodies have an enzyme known by the abbreviation AMPK. That's the so-called activated protein kinase, right? This enzyme's job is to make sure glucose from our blood gets into our muscles so they can use it as energy. So when you start doing, say, endurance training, your body ramps up production of this AMPK enzyme, ensuring those working muscles get more sugar to produce more energy. But what else happens at the same time? When more glucose gets into the muscles, our blood sugar level drops and our sensitivity to insulin increases. And that's exactly why exercise is so important for diabetics, because they need to get glucose out of the blood and into the muscles, so the muscles can process it and keep blood sugar from rising. So when we exercise and the gene for producing the AMPK enzyme switches on, our blood sugar level starts to drop. And in effect, this can practically cure diabetes. Thank you.
Blaney, so we've mentioned the two strongest epigenetic factors. They are nutrition and exercise, but stress is also a very powerful epigenetic factor.
I'd say everything going on in our head, our thoughts, our emotions is a strong epigenetic factor. But these are things that are hard to study scientifically. We can study the level of stress and, based on that, measure changes in our genes' activity. That can be done quite well. So let me give you a concrete example. In 1983, a massive snowstorm hit Quebec, Canada. The snowstorm caused such a disaster that it trapped some people in their homes for up to 40 days. It was an extremely stressful event, especially for women who were pregnant at the time. It turned out that about 6 to 7 years later, scientists began examining their DNA and measuring the degree of methylation changes in their children. It turned out that these children typically had certain methylation patterns in their DNA that had been noted. These patterns, for example, can lower intelligence and increase other risks. Their risk of allergies and other immune disorders was caused specifically by negative methylation changes that arose as a result of their mother's stress. And the link was so strong that, based on how long the mother had been confined to her home during pregnancy, scientists could estimate the exact extent of those negative methylation changes. The child had them, and it almost always matched. The longer the mother was shut in and couldn't leave the house, the more stressed she became, and the more of those negative methylation changes appeared in her child's DNA. But as I said, this is easy to measure, whereas feelings like fear, frustration, and so on are much harder to measure. You could also try to measure it in children. Children who go through severe trauma, if we try to put that into numbers, are strongly affected by their family's socioeconomic status. That means the family's financial situation and its social standing. And it turns out that when the family's socioeconomic status is very low, the child suffers because of it. Because an adult might say, so what? I'm poor. That's my problem. If it bothers you, that's your problem. But for a child, that's trauma. It changes the activity of genes in the brain that are, again, responsible for certain functions. For example, genes linked to stress resilience and inflammation levels. Children who went through this have a much higher risk in adulthood of depression and, for instance, cardiovascular disease. So these negative effects that can be expressed in numbers are well mapped from a scientific perspective, but they undoubtedly apply to everything going on in our heads. Any strong or long-term negative thoughts and emotions, from an epigenetic perspective, they damage our DNA and directly contribute to the onset of diseases.
Thank you. I'll give another example, a bit less technical, and I'll compare it to a bank. We have experience with a high-ranking doctor, a surgeon from a Prague hospital, and by the age of 43, he ended up undergoing rehabilitation at an Alzheimer's center. Basically, he ended up there because, most likely, certain functions in his body shut down. All the good genes seemed to switch off, and I'd say some degenerative ones switched on. After half a year there, the good ones switched back on, and now he's operating again. For me and for Blanny, another strong epigenetic factor could be sleep.
I wasn't talking about you. Sleep is a powerful epigenetic factor. It's been proven that even a single night without sleep changes that. Like I said, that quicker, more adaptive response called histone modification. So even just one night without sleep can lower the activity of some of our genes responsible for mental performance. That's exactly why when we don't sleep, our thinking gets a bit slower. But when we go without sleep for a long time, changes start happening in that hardwired response in the methylation of our genes. So if we don't sleep for a long time, it increases not only the risk of mental problems, but also the risk of cardiovascular disease, cancer, and similar issues. But it's not just about sleep itself. It's also about circadian rhythms, or our internal biological clock. If they get disrupted in some way, things don't work as they should. That disruption shows up in the epigenetic side of our DNA and significantly increases our risk of certain problems. Whether it's more serious issues like cancer or the proven fact that people who work shifts have a much higher risk of obesity, which is also related to epigenetic changes in the body.
Thanks, Blanny. We have a really interesting podcast episode, 40-something, I'm not sure exactly, and it's on the topic of microplastics. Right now, it's a powerful epigenetic factor. Yes.
I've actually been warning about microplastics for quite a long time because ever since I first read about them a few years ago, I thought, this is going to be a big problem. And in just the past 2 years, there's suddenly been a huge surge in research showing that microplastics can wreak havoc in the body. Here's one example that says it all. In China, there was a large-scale study that surveyed 1,000 or maybe tens of thousands of people about their eating habits and found that people who often order food from restaurants have a much higher risk of cardiovascular disease. That's because when plastics come into contact with hot food, like when a restaurant puts food into plastic containers, when it comes into contact with hot food, it starts releasing huge amounts of microplastics, which then settle throughout the body. Some of them, if they're small enough, can even get into the brain by crossing the blood-brain barrier. In pregnant women, these nanoplastics pass through the placental barrier into the baby's blood and settle there. And people who have a lot of microplastics in their blood tend to have them build up in large amounts in those atherosclerotic plaques in the blood vessels. So if we're highly exposed to microplastics, the risk of heart and vascular diseases increases significantly. There's no research on this yet, but personally, I believe that the rise in inflammatory bowel diseases is also a major problem today. The incidence of diseases like Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis has risen sharply in recent years. And I think it's precisely because of microplastics, since when a microplastic gets into our body, the first thing it does is damage the intestinal wall. And once something is damaged, immune cells start moving in and releasing inflammatory cytokines. And on top of that, the immune system also targets the tiny piece of plastic that's circulating there. The body sees it as a foreign substance, so it starts attacking it. So, microplastics, they significantly increase inflammation throughout the body.
Two things. Also, this probably affects women more. We also recently did an episode about the thyroid, and I think you mentioned something about how microplastics can contribute to its underactivity.
Hypothyroidism is an autoimmune disease. So basically, it's a condition where our immune cells attack the thyroid gland, and it has a strong link to inflammation in the body. And again, it can increase the risk of thyroid diseases, mainly in terms of that's hypothyroidism.
Thanks. And another strong epigenetic factor is probably the environment we live in, whether it's a city, a village, the mountains, or the seaside.
Most environmental pollutants have negative epigenetic effects. For example, take lead, for example. Why does lead cause such severe degenerative changes in the brain? It's precisely because it has negative epigenetic effects. Lead in the brain, and not just in the brain, but in other parts of the body too, causes negative epigenetic changes. But this applies to most harmful substances we already know are harmful. For example, fine dust particles from traffic can significantly increase our risk of Alzheimer's disease. Problematic substances include those added to plastics, like BTA, phthalates, and so on. All of these have strong negative epigenetic effects.
Great. We've covered the strongest epigenetic factors, but I'd still like to tell our listeners how they can easily switch their genes on and off in a shorter, simplified way. And this is basically a specific area of nutrition. You can actually turn them on and off using certain epigenetic dietary supplements, herbs, nutrients, and the like. Could you say something about that?
Basically, many dietary supplements have epigenetic effects. As I mentioned earlier, most herbs work through epigenetics, meaning they switch genes in our DNA on and off. That's why herbs, with few exceptions, don't work right away. It takes time for those reactions to switch on and off properly. So, when I first read about it, it was about 10 years ago. This information, for example, it said that roughly 1/3 of the herbs used in traditional Chinese medicine have epigenetic effects. But over the past 10 years, epigenetics research has advanced rapidly, especially in China, where traditional Chinese medicine is part of their national ideology. So they invest huge resources into it. That research into the effects of herbs. These days, whatever herb I look into to see if it has epigenetic effects, I almost always find that it does.
Yes, but there are some. Some of these supplements are more broad spectrum, like epigallocatechin gallate, EGCG, while others are less broad spectrum and target specific issues like joint inflammation, arthritis, mesothelioma according to Ratha, and so on. Can we name some of the strongest ones?
If some
Strongest ones?
If someone wanted to explore this further, it's basically tied to nutrition. It turns out that most cultures around the world have something in their diet with strong epigenetic effects. The Japanese consume many of them, which could be one reason why so many Japanese people live long lives, because many of the typical ingredients in their diet have strong epigenetic effects. These effects are often broad spectrum and strongly focused on processes like gene methylation. So when they consume that food regularly over time, it has a lasting positive impact on the activity of genes in their DNA. As you mentioned, EGCG, epigallocatechin gallate, is abundant in green tea. The Japanese are, of course, famous for drinking a lot of green tea. If we drink about 3 to 4 cups of high quality green tea, because if we just dunk a tea bag, there's almost no EGCG in it and there are microplastics. Yes, but quality green teas have a high EGCG content. So if I drink 3 to 4 cups every day for my whole life, I'll be getting a steady dose of EGCG, which is strong enough to positively influence epigenetic changes in our body over the long term. If I don't want to drink 3 to 4 cups of green tea daily, there's a shortcut. I can take EGCG as a dietary supplement, but the Japanese don't just have EGCG, they also eat a lot of soy. It's worth noting they eat fermented soy products, and fermentation is really important because otherwise, soy is an anti-nutrient. It reduces protein absorption. If we eat fermented soy, we get a huge amount of genistein, which is another nutrient with very strong epigenetic effects. Similarly, they eat a lot of seaweed and fish, which contain omega-3 fatty acids that, besides being an essential structural part of our cells, especially brain cells, also have strong epigenetic effects. And especially in terms of gene methylation, Indian cuisine, for example, includes turmeric, the spice, which contains curcumin, which is, again, one of the most powerful substances with epigenetic effects and massive anti-inflammatory properties, with positive effects on the brain, physical performance, the heart and blood vessels, and even against cancer. And again, if I don't want to eat Indian food every day, I can make it easier by taking turmeric either as a dietary supplement or by making one of those golden milk, or whatever it's called. Yeah, so these substances can be part of a regular diet and can also be taken as dietary supplements. It's possible to take them long term and by doing so have a lasting positive effect on the activity of the genes in our DNA.
Ma'am, thank you. You mentioned genistein. That's actually an epigenetic agent, a substance that works best for women going through menopause. And with that, I'd like to move on to our own experiences.
It's actually connected to aging too, because as we get older, negative epigenetic changes build up in our DNA. And by paying attention to those epigenetic factors, we're basically extending our lifespan. And most importantly, we're extending our healthy years. It's also connected to how our mitochondria function, because mitochondria are the little organelles inside our cells, and their job is to turn nutrients into energy. Mitochondria have their own DNA. And when our mitochondria are active and plentiful in our cells, we're able to produce enough energy. But when mitochondria become dysfunctional, maybe because their DNA got damaged through some kind of epigenetic pathway, that's when aging speeds up and diseases start to develop, because those tissues suddenly don't have enough energy. It particularly affects brain tissue because brain tissue, relative to its weight, it's the biggest energy hog in the body. And if the mitochondria in brain tissue aren't working well enough, then the brain just doesn't have energy. It starts to deteriorate and our mental performance declines. For example, in most diseases that affect the brain, whether it's dementia like Alzheimer's disease or depression and similar conditions, in all brain-related diseases, mitochondrial dysfunction is present, so that's another way we can influence how we age. And now I've kind of lost my train of thought and forgotten what the first point was.
The question was, we were talking about genistein and, well, basically about menopause.
Right, so basically in menopause, what's typical is that the production of sex hormones stops. And in fact, all the hormones in our body are powerful epigenetic players. Because hormones influence what's called cellular signaling, a hormone binds to a receptor on one of our cells or enters inside the cell. And at that moment, the cell gets the signal that something needs to happen inside. And quite often, that signal comes specifically through the hormone influencing the activity of certain specific genes. So all the hormones in our body, they're epigenetic agents. They influence the activity of certain genes. Our DNA. During menopause, our ovaries basically stop producing those sex hormones. So the body starts working less efficiently because that function basically stops. This aspect is exactly what happens during menopause, when the aging process starts to accelerate sharply. According to research, when menopause begins, aging speeds up by about 6%. So it's the same in that, besides its epigenetic effects, it's also a very strong phytoestrogen, one of the most potent phytoestrogens known in nature. And that genistin starts binding to estrogen receptors, which are found not only in the reproductive organs, but throughout the whole body, including the brain. So that's why, for example, certain risks increase during menopause, such as various mental health problems, depression, anxiety, and also a decline in cognitive performance. That's where it comes into play. It's also why the risk of osteoporosis rises during menopause. There are estrogen receptors in the bones, and there are estrogen receptors in the blood vessels. Basically, when those receptors are occupied by estrogen, they help protect a woman's body against cardiovascular diseases. And genistin, because it can bind to those estrogen receptors throughout the body, not only affects epigenetic reactions, but also influences this hormonal signaling.
Last year, thanks, I gave a simpler example. We had this case where a man came in, not his wife, saying that her 45-year-old husband needed something for immunity, and he had read up on our Apiva website that turmeric with piperine would be good for that. Piperine actually boosts absorption and effectiveness. So she gave it to him for his immunity, but after about 2 months, the guy started growing hair again, even though he'd been bald, so his hair came back, which switched on the genes that had been turned off. And then we had another one.
In this case, it was the other way around. Let me remind you, it didn't switch them on, it actually switched them off. That's a good example of male pattern baldness. Why does it actually happen? A lot of people think it's related to testosterone, but that's obviously nonsense. Because if it were true that the more testosterone you have, the more bald you get, then all 25-year-old guys would be bald. And if testosterone dropped, their hair would start growing back, which obviously doesn't happen. So baldness is actually caused by what's called dihydrotestosterone, which is formed from testosterone through the action of an enzyme called 5-alpha reductase. And curcumin can reduce the activity of the genes responsible for producing this enzyme, which means the conversion of testosterone can't fully take place into dihydrotestosterone, which slows down male pattern baldness. This guy was an extreme case. Most of the time, it doesn't work like a guy just starts taking curcumin and his hair suddenly grows back, but it can significantly slow down hair loss.
Great. And then we have another example. This might be more relevant for your older moms or grandmothers. A 75-year-old lady. She was actually diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. She was prescribed epigallocatechin galate, EGZG, and omega-3 in the morning. For lunch, she had turmeric, and for dinner, she had resveratrol, which she washed down with a small glass of red wine. That helps it absorb better. A month later, she got up and cooked a meal. Whether it was edible is beside the point. What matters is that she got herself into that kind of shape. After 2 months, she was already out working in the garden. After about 3 to 4 months, she was able to go shopping on her own. And after half a year, she even started dressing up to go shopping. She was buying new clothes, which, when you think about it, at a time when someone is stuck at home, can't get up, and has trouble even standing because their muscles have wasted away, that's a huge achievement, both for her and for the family. That's it. We've got more stories like that, but we don't have the time. We probably need to wrap up in just a moment. I'm not sure how many minutes we have left, but before we finish, I just wanted to say we've covered a lot. We haven't said everything, but Blaney, what do you think our listeners here in the auditorium should take away from today?
They should mainly take away the idea that we are, in fact, the masters of our own genes. We can't change the genes we inherited from our parents. That's simply something we're born with. But we can strongly influence how our genes get switched on or off. Whether that happens the right way matters because, as I mentioned before, some genes are permanently switched off and there's no way to change that. And conversely, some genes need to be switched on and off as needed, because if those genes were switched on all the time, our bodies would constantly be producing proteins, which you can easily imagine would be a huge problem, because our bodies would swell up, tissues would swell too, and we'd just expand in every direction. So we need the genes we have and can influence to switch on and off exactly when we need them to. And we can control a big part of these processes ourselves through the way we eat, whether we stay active, how we sleep, whether we're stressed, and of course, we can influence that with our own thoughts. Basically, every thought we have, if it's strong and intense, has the potential to switch our genes on or off.
We've already said that meditation is good.
Yeah, meditation. I mentioned at the start that meditation is a very powerful epigenetic factor. That's mainly because meditation has been proven to reduce. It's been proven to lower the amount of stress hormones released in our bodies, and those stress hormones, they're kind of a double-edged sword. On one hand, we really need them, even the so-called bad ones, those so-called stress hormones. If we didn't have cortisol, we'd be in big trouble, because it's cortisol that lets us get up in the morning and start functioning. That's why our cortisol level is highest in the morning, because cortisol helps us generate energy, gets us moving, and allows us to be active. But if there's too much cortisol, from an epigenetics perspective, it can damage many of the genes in our DNA. And meditation is one of the most effective ways we can reduce the stress load in our body. Breathing exercises do the same. Yoga does the same, Tai Chi, and all those kinds of practices. All of that really makes a big difference to the amount of stress your body is under. But of course, there are other principles involved too, because the moment a person manages to calm down, they can quiet their thoughts. Our brain is an amazing thing because it allows us to think and reason. But at the same time, that huge mental activity often gets in the way. It keeps us from being in touch with our body and certain energies. And by calming our thoughts, we create space. Space to be in touch with something greater than ourselves. And that might have some epigenetic effects, even though science hasn't confirmed it yet, because things like this are pretty hard to study. Let's be honest, but I'm convinced it works that way too. By being in touch with ourselves, our inner world, our spiritual essence, we can also effectively influence the activity of our genes.
Excellent, because sports and physical activity are among the most powerful. Speaking of genetic factors, I'd like to ask all of you to stand up. Thank you. Place your hands down. Lift them into this position. Look at Blanka, and please give her a round of applause.
Thank you.
And with that, Blanka Pechkova Gololova is signing off.
Have a wonderful day.
And I, Petra Ilyashova, wish you a wonderful day and to keep things under control every day.